Somewhere in the darkness, you are listening. Perhaps it is late where you are. Perhaps the world around you has grown quiet, and only this voice remains. The hum of the day has faded. The distractions have dissolved. And now, in whatever hour has brought you here, you have found your way to a story that has waited thousands of years to be told again. Before we begin, I want to know something about you. Where are you right now? What city holds you tonight? What country? What time blows softly on your clock as these words reach your ears? Write it in the comments below. Tell me where you are listening from and what hour has drawn you here. There is something profound about knowing that we are scattered across the globe, separated by oceans and continents and time zones, yet gathered together in the same story at the same moment, connected by nothing but curiosity and the sound of a voice in the dark. And if this channel has ever kept you company through the long hours, if these words have ever made the silence feel less empty, or the questions feel safer to ask, then I ask you to do something small but meaningful before we continue. Press the like button. It costs nothing but a moment, yet it helps this story reach others who are searching for it without knowing what they are looking for. Subscribe if you have not already, so that we can meet again like this in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps and the deeper questions rise to the surface. And turn on the notification bell, that small icon that ensures you will know when the next chapter is ready, when the next piece of this ancient puzzle emerges from the shadows. Now, settle in. Let the tension leave your body. Let the noise of the day fade completely. Because tonight, we are going to count the years that were never meant to be counted. We are going to trace a calendar older than calendars themselves, a rhythm of time that existed before humanity learned to mark the seasons, before we built our first cities, before we carved our first symbols into stone. And we are going to ask a question that has been buried beneath every empire, every flood, every collapse that has swept across this planet since the beginning of recorded memory. Why does catastrophe follow a rhythm? Why does history repeat itself, not randomly, not chaotically, but with a precision that suggests design rather than accident? And what happens when the count reaches zero once again? This is the story of the Anunnaki calendar. This is the story of the number 3600. And this is the story of what returns when the great cycle completes. Let us begin. There is a number that should not exist in the records of ancient humanity. It appears in the oldest texts our species possesses, carved into clay tablets when writing itself was a new invention, when the very concept of recording information for future generations was revolutionary. The Sumerians, who lived in what is now southern Iraq more than 5,000 years ago, possessed no telescopes. They had no satellites, no space probes, no mathematical models capable of calculating orbital mechanics across vast distances. They had no apparent reason to know what lay beyond the visible sky. Yet they recorded a number with absolute certainty, a number that would take modern astronomy thousands of years to even begin to understand. 3,600. In the Sumerian mathematical system, which was based on the number 60 rather than the number 10 that we use today, this number held special significance. They called it a sar. One sar equaled 60 times 60, which is 3,600. It represented one complete cycle, one great year, the time required for something to depart and return. But return from where? And return to what? The Sumerians were remarkably specific in their answer. They spoke of a celestial body, a planet that moved through the heavens on an orbit so vast, so elongated, that it spent most of its journey in the cold darkness far from the sun. They called this world Nibiru, a name that translates roughly as the crossing planet, or the planet of the crossing, because its orbit crossed through the known solar system before carrying it back out into the distant reaches of space. According to their records, Nibiru completed one orbit around the Sun every 3,600 Earth years. This means that what we experience as 36 centuries, what we experience as the rise and fall of multiple empires, what we experience as more than 100 human generations, was for Nibiru and its inhabitants merely a single year. Modern astronomy has largely dismissed this idea. There is no confirmed planet with a 3,600-year orbit, scientists say. There is no direct observational evidence of a large body in the outer solar system following the precise path the Sumerians described. But there is something else. There is a rhythm. And the rhythm is far harder to dismiss than the planet itself. Because when you lay the full span of human history flat and begin to measure the distance between catastrophes, between unexplained collapses, a pattern emerges from the chaos. And that pattern counts in increments that align disturbingly well with the number the Sumerians recorded more than 5,000 years ago. This is not mysticism. This is not wishful thinking or pattern recognition run wild. This is arithmetic, applied carefully to the archaeological and geological record. And arithmetic does not lie, even when the implications of its answers are difficult to accept. Before we examine the evidence for this cycle, there is something crucial to understand about how it works. The catastrophes associated with the cycle do not occur only at the precise moment of closest approach. They are not single events confined to a specific year or even a specific decade. The effects begin centuries before the crossing and continue centuries after, as gravitational forces disturb the delicate balance of the inner solar system, long before the source of that disturbance becomes visible. Imagine dropping a stone into still water. The ripples spread outward, reaching the shore long before someone standing at the edge could see the stone itself. The cycle operates similarly. The gravitational influence of a massive body on an elliptical orbit would begin affecting the asteroid belt, the Oort cloud, the orbits of comets and debris, centuries before the body itself crossed through the inner solar system. This means that the window of danger is not a single year. It is a period of centuries, perhaps longer, during which the probability of catastrophic events increases significantly. Earthquakes intensify. Volcanic activity increases. Objects are deflected from stable orbits and sent careening toward the inner planets. Climate patterns destabilize. By the time the crossing itself occurs, the world has already been experiencing the effects for generations. And the effects into as the gravitational source recedes, the ripples still spreading even as the stone falls away into the depths. This understanding changes how we must interpret the historical record. The collapses we can identify may not mark the exact moment of crossing. They may mark moments within the approach phase or moments during the recession. The pattern is real, but it is not a pattern of single points. It is a pattern of periods, windows of instability that can span centuries. And this has profound implications for understanding where we stand today. To understand what the Sumerians knew, we must first understand how they understood time itself. We measure time in days, months, and years based on the movements we can observe from Earth. A day is one rotation of our planet. A month roughly corresponds to one cycle of the moon. A year is one complete orbit around the sun. These units feel natural to us because they are tied to rhythms we experience directly. But the Sumerians operated with an additional layer of temporal understanding. They believed that beyond the human scale of time, there existed a cosmic scale, a calendar used by beings whose lifespans and perspectives dwarfed our own. This cosmic calendar measured time not in Earth years, but in SAR, in units of 3,600. The implications of this belief become clear when we examine one of the strangest documents to survive from the ancient world, a text known as the Sumerian King List. The Sumerian King List is not mythology in the way we typically understand that term. It is a historical document, or at least it was intended to be one. It records the names of kings who ruled over the cities of Mesopotamia in unbroken succession, stretching back into the mists of time. Copies of this list were maintained across multiple cities, updated as new kings rose to power, treated as an official record of legitimate authority. For the later portions of the list, covering periods closer to when the tablets were actually written, the information is largely consistent with other historical evidence. The kings are real. Their reign lengths are plausible. The events described can be corroborated through other sources. But the earlier portions of the list tell a very different story. Before a great flood that the Sumerians recorded as a historical event, kings ruled for periods that seem impossible by any human standard. The list names 8 kings who ruled before the deluge, and their reign lengths are staggering. One king, named Alurlim, ruled for 28,800 years. Another, named Al-Algar, ruled for 36,000 years. Enmen-Luana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Galana ruled for 28,800 years. The god Dumuzi, shepherd of the city of Bad Tabira, ruled for 36,000 years. And so the list continues, with reign lengths that add up to a total of 241,200 years before the flood came, and, as the text puts it, kingship was lowered from heaven once again. Scholars have struggled with these numbers for generations. The most common explanation is that they are symbolic, exaggerated for religious or political purposes, or perhaps the result of errors in copying or translation over the millennia. Some have suggested that the numbers represent not years, but months, or some other smaller unit of time. But there is another possibility that these explanations overlook, a possibility that emerges when you examine the numbers themselves more carefully. Every single one of those impossibly long reign lengths is divisible by 3,600. Alulim's 28,800 years equals exactly 8 Sar. Al-Algar's 36,000 years equals exactly 10 Sar. Enmen-Luana's 43,200 years equals exactly 12 Sar. This pattern holds throughout the antediluvian section of the King List. The numbers are not random. They are not the result of scribal errors or symbolic exaggeration. They are precise multiples of the cosmic unit the Sumerians called Sar. This suggests something that changes how we must interpret the document entirely. The Sumerians were not counting in human years when they recorded these early reigns. They were counting in returns. Each king's reign was measured not by how long he lived, in our sense, but by how many times the great cycle completed while he held power. A reign of 8 Sar meant that Nibiru completed 8 orbits during that king's rule. 8 passages through the inner solar system, 8 returns. If the beings who ruled during this era were the Anunnaki themselves, as Sumerian texts explicitly claim, then this method of counting makes perfect sense. They were measuring time in the units that mattered to them, in the years of their own world, rather than the brief years of Earth. And this means that the Anunnaki experienced time in a way fundamentally different from humanity. A single orbit of Nibiru, a single year by their reckoning, equaled 3,600 of our years. What feels to us like the entire span of recorded human civilization would be, to them, a period roughly equivalent to what a year and a half feels like to us. They watched us the way we might watch fruit flies in a laboratory, generations flickering past in what seems like moments, entire civilizations rising and falling in the span of what they would consider a single season. This temporal difference explains much about the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity as described in ancient texts. The gods seem distant, uninvolved, appearing only at crucial moments before withdrawing again into silence. Their interventions seem sporadic from our perspective, separated by centuries or millennia of apparent absence. But from their perspective, they were checking in regularly. They were returning with each orbit, each year of their cosmic calendar, to assess the progress of the world they had shaped and the species they had created. The silence between returns was not abandonment. It was simply the gap between visits. Now let us examine what brought the Anunnaki to Earth in the first place, and what role humanity was designed to play in their plans. The Sumerians recorded that the Anunnaki came to Earth for a specific purpose. They needed resources, and Earth possessed them in abundance. Gold is mentioned specifically and repeatedly as the primary objective. They needed gold in vast quantities, more than could be easily obtained, more than the Anunnaki themselves wished to extract through their own labor. Why gold? The texts offer hints without complete explanation. Some passages suggest it was needed for the atmosphere of Nibiru, that particles of gold suspended in the air could repair damage to their world's protective envelope, damage that threatened the survival of their civilization. Others hint at technological applications, uses for gold that went beyond anything the human slaves would have understood. Gold possesses unique properties that make it valuable for applications beyond mere ornamentation. It is an exceptional conductor of electricity. It does not corrode or react with most chemicals. It can be beaten into sheets thin enough to become translucent while remaining intact. It reflects infrared radiation, making it useful for heat shielding. Modern spacecraft use gold coating for exactly this purpose, protecting sensitive instruments from solar radiation. If an advanced civilization needed to protect their planet's atmosphere from radiation, gold particles suspended in the upper atmosphere could serve that function. The particles would reflect incoming radiation while remaining stable and non-reactive indefinitely. No other material combines these properties in the same way. The quantity needed for such a project would be immense, To treat an entire planetary atmosphere would require amounts of gold far exceeding anything a small group could extract through their own labor. The Earth possesses gold in abundance, distributed across the planet in various forms, from nuggets in streams to microscopic particles in ordinary rock. But extracting gold is labor-intensive, difficult, and dangerous. Initially, the Anunnaki performed the mining work themselves, but the labor was brutal, exhausting, unending. The texts describe a class of lesser Anunnaki called the Egigi, who were assigned to the mines, who toiled in the depths extracting ore, while the greater gods oversaw operations from above. The Egigi were not slaves in the human sense. They were members of the same species as the ruling Anunnaki, but of lower rank, assigned to tasks that the leadership considered beneath their own dignity. In the hierarchical society of Nibiru, birth determined status, and status determined what work one was required to perform. For thousands of years, by the Anunnaki reckoning, which means hundreds of thousands of years by ours, the Egigi labored in the mines. They dug shafts. They processed ore. They endured conditions that even their advanced physiology found difficult. And eventually, they reached their limit. The Sumerian texts describe the rebellion of the Egigi in vivid terms. They gathered together. They burned their tools. They surrounded the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator of the Earth Project, the one responsible for organizing and directing their labor. They demanded relief. They refused to continue. This was a crisis unlike any the Anunnaki had faced before. Their entire project depended on the extraction of gold. Without the Egigi's labor, the operation would halt. But forcing the Egigi to return to work was not simple. They were not mindless machines that could be reprogrammed. They were conscious beings with their own will, their own grievances, their own understanding of the injustice of their situation. Various solutions were proposed and debated. Some favored harsh punishment, making examples of the rebellion's leaders to force the others back into compliance. But this approach risked escalating the conflict rather than resolving it. The Egigi outnumbered the ruling class significantly. An open war would be costly and might not end in the leadership's favor. Enki proposed a different solution. Rather than forcing the Egigi to continue their labor, why not create a new class of workers specifically designed for the task? Beings that would have the intelligence to follow instructions and use tools, but would lack the status and self-awareness that made the Egigi unwilling to continue. A worker class that would not rebel because it would not know that rebellion was possible. The idea was controversial. Creating new life was not a trivial undertaking. It raised questions about responsibility, about the ethics of bringing into existence beings designed for servitude. But the alternatives were worse. The project could not continue without labor. The Egigi would not provide that labor voluntarily, and the resources of Nibiru depended on the gold that only Earth could provide in sufficient quantities. The decision was made. Humanity would be created. The process, as described in the texts, combined biological material from Earth with genetic contributions from the Anunnaki themselves. The goddess Ninhursag, expert in matters of birth and life, worked with Enki to develop the new creature. They experimented with various combinations, producing failures and monsters before achieving a viable result. The key breakthrough involved the use of blood from a slain god, a lesser Anunnaki, who was sacrificed to provide the essential ingredient that would give the new creature intelligence and purpose. This blood was mixed with clay, the base biological material that formed the new creature's body. This created a hybrid that combined Earth's native biology with the consciousness-bearing elements of Anunnaki heritage. The result was us, humanity, a new species, neither fully of Earth nor fully of Nibiru, designed from the beginning to serve the needs of beings who saw us as tools rather than equals. The first humans were not born but made, created in batches, shaped in the image of their creators, but limited in crucial ways. We were given intelligence, but not understanding. We were given skill, but not knowledge. We were given life, but not freedom. And for a time the system worked as intended. Humanity multiplied. We spread across the regions where the Anunnaki had established their operations. We mined the gold, processed it, accumulated it for collection when our creators required it. We built the structures they designed, maintained the systems they established, followed the instructions they provided. But something unexpected happened over the long millennia of the project. We grew. We developed capabilities that had not been anticipated when we were first designed. We began to think independently, to ask questions, to want things for ourselves rather than simply serving the purposes we had been created for. The spark of divine intelligence that Enki had given us proved more potent than expected. We were becoming something more than tools. The texts describe this development with a mixture of wonder and concern. Humanity was multiplying faster than anticipated. Our skills were improving beyond what was necessary for simple labor. We were forming social structures, developing languages more complex than required for following instructions, creating art and music that served no practical purpose whatsoever. Most troubling, from some perspectives, we were beginning to understand our situation. Not fully, not explicitly, but in ways that manifested as restlessness, as ambition, as a desire for something more than the endless cycle of work and reproduction that had been assigned to us. The noise of humanity troubled the gods. The texts describe Enlil being unable to sleep because of the clamor that humanity produced. This can be read literally as a complaint about noise, but it can also be interpreted more broadly. Humanity had become disruptive. We were no longer a quiet, manageable workforce. We were becoming something unpredictable. This development created tension among the Anunnaki. Some saw humanity's growth as a threat, a deviation from the intended design that needed to be corrected or eliminated. Others saw potential, a species that might eventually become something more than servants. Two figures emerged from these debates as representatives of opposing positions. Enlil, who had never wanted humanity created in the first place, favored strict control. He had argued against Enki's proposal from the beginning. He had predicted that creating a conscious species for servitude would lead to problems. And now he felt vindicated. Enlil's position was not based on cruelty, though it would manifest in ways that humanity would experience as cruel. He was an administrator, a systems thinker, someone whose primary concern was the stability and functionality of the project. From his perspective, humanity was a component in a larger system, and that component was malfunctioning. The logical response was to adjust, restrict, or replace the faulty component. He proposed various measures: reducing the human population through disease, limiting our access to food, restricting our expansion into new territories. Enki held a different view. He had created humanity, or at least had been instrumental in our creation. He felt something closer to parental responsibility for the species he had helped bring into existence. Where Enlil saw malfunction, Enki saw growth. Where Enlil saw threat, Enki saw potential. Enki argued that humanity's development, far from being a problem, was an unexpected success. We had exceeded our design specifications. We had demonstrated capacities that had not been anticipated. This was not failure. This was emergence, the appearance of new properties from systems that had been designed for simpler purposes. He believed that humanity deserved the chance to continue developing, to see what we might eventually become. Perhaps we would prove useful in ways that went beyond manual labor. Perhaps we would develop capabilities that even the Anunnaki lacked. Perhaps, given enough time, we would become worthy of treatment as something more than slaves. The conflict between Enlil and Enki would shape everything that followed. It would determine the course of human history, though humanity itself would not understand the forces acting upon it. We would experience their conflict as the capriciousness of gods, as unpredictable swings between favor and disaster. But before that conflict reached its climax, another crisis emerged, one that would require the most drastic intervention in human history. The Anunnaki could not remain on Earth continuously. When Nibiru's orbit carried it back into the outer reaches of the solar system, the distance became too great for practical travel. Most of the Anunnaki would need to return to their home world, leaving only a skeleton crew to maintain operations during the long absence. But the project required ongoing supervision. Humanity was still young, still unpredictable, prone to deviation from intended parameters. Leaving us entirely unsupervised for thousands of years seemed risky. The investment the Anunnaki had made in creating us, in establishing the infrastructure for resource extraction, all of this could be lost if humanity went off course during the long absence. The solution was the Watchers. The concept of the Watchers appears across multiple ancient traditions, though it is most explicitly described in texts that were excluded from the biblical canon. Texts that the early church considered dangerous or inappropriate for general circulation. The Book of Enoch is the primary source for our understanding of the Watchers. This text, attributed to the great-grandfather of Noah, was widely known and respected in the ancient world. It is quoted in the New Testament. It was considered scripture by many early Christian communities. Yet it was eventually rejected from the biblical canon and largely forgotten by Western civilization for over 1,000 years, until manuscripts were rediscovered in Ethiopia in the 18th century. Why was this text suppressed? What information did it contain that was considered too dangerous for ordinary believers? The Book of Enoch describes 200 watchers, beings who were assigned to observe humanity during the absence of the higher gods. They were given specific instructions: watch, monitor, report, but do not interfere directly. Do not share knowledge that humanity is not ready to receive. Do not form attachments that might compromise the objectivity required for the mission. For a time, the Watchers followed their instructions. They observed from their stations, taking note of human developments, maintaining the surveillance that the absent Anunnaki required. But time has a way of changing even those who seem beyond change. The Watchers were not automatons. They were conscious beings with desires and curiosities of their own. And humanity, for all our limitations, possessed something that caught their interest. Perhaps it was our creativity. Perhaps it was our capacity for emotion. Perhaps it was simply the intimacy that comes from long observation, the way a researcher might become attached to the subjects of a study. Whatever the cause, some of the watchers began to exceed their mandate. It started with small violations, knowledge shared that should have been withheld, assistance provided in moments of crisis, relationships formed that blurred the line between observer and participant. And then it went further. The Book of Enoch describes a specific transgression. The watchers looked upon human women and found them beautiful. They desired them, and they acted on that desire. 200 watchers descended from their positions, took human wives, and produced offspring. This was not merely a moral failing. It was a contamination of the experiment. The genetic boundaries that defined humanity were breached. Something new entered the human gene pool, something that had not been intended, something that could not be easily removed. The offspring of the watchers and human women were called the Nephilim. The texts describe them as giants, beings of tremendous size and appetite, who dominated the earth and consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. They were neither fully human nor fully watcher, but something between, hybrids that did not belong to either category. The presence of the Nephilim caused cascading problems. They competed with ordinary humans for resources. They demanded more than the earth could sustainably provide. Their existence represented a fundamental deviation from the plan, a corruption that threatened to make the entire project unrecoverable. But the problem went beyond mere resource consumption. The Watchers had not merely bred with humans, they had taught them. According to the Book of Enoch, different Watchers taught humanity different forbidden arts. One taught the making of weapons and armor, accelerating human capacity for violence far beyond what natural development would have produced. Another taught cosmetics and ornamentation, introducing vanity and deception. Others taught astrology, astronomy, the reading of omens, the crafting of medicines and poisons. Each of these teachings represented knowledge that had been deliberately withheld. The Anunnaki had intended for humanity to develop slowly, remaining dependent and manageable. The Watchers had bypassed that gradual process, equipping humans with capabilities they were not prepared to handle responsibly. The result was chaos. Human violence increased as weapons became more deadly and more available. Social structures that had been stable for generations broke down as new knowledge disrupted traditional hierarchies. The careful balance the Anunnaki had established was destabilized from within, and the Nephilim only made things worse. These giant offspring of the Watchers consumed everything in their path. When the food ran out, the ancient texts tell us, they began to consume humanity itself. The world had become corrupted beyond recognition. The experiment had failed. Something had to be done. When the Anunnaki became aware of what had happened, their response was severe. The Watchers who had transgressed were punished. The Book of Enoch describes their imprisonment in darkness, bound in chains, waiting for a final judgment that would come at the end of ages. They were not merely disciplined. They were removed from the equation entirely. Their interference terminated permanently. But the consequences of their interference could not be so easily erased. The Nephilim existed. Humanity had been changed. The knowledge that had been shared could not be unlearned. A more comprehensive solution was required. This is where Enlil saw his opportunity. He had always believed humanity was a mistake, a creation that should never have been made. Now he had evidence to support his position. Look at what had happened. Look at the corruption, the violence, the chaos. The experiment had failed. It was time to wipe the slate clean. Enlil proposed the flood. Not a local flood, not a seasonal inundation, a complete cleansing, a deluge that would cover the earth and destroy virtually all land-based life. The Nephilim would drown. The corrupted human bloodlines would be eliminated. The forbidden knowledge would be lost when those who possessed it perished. The other gods agreed, bound by oath to keep the decision secret from humanity, so that none would escape. But Enki dissented. He could not bring himself to destroy the species he had helped create. He found a loophole in his oath, not speaking directly to a human, but speaking to a wall, while a human happened to be listening. That human was Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian account, Noah in the Hebrew tradition. He was warned to build a vessel, to gather specimens of animal life, to preserve the seeds of the world that was about to be destroyed. There is an important detail about why this particular man was chosen. The texts describe Noah as perfect in his generations. This phrase has puzzled translators and commentators for millennia. What does it mean to be perfect in one's generations? The moral interpretation suggests he was righteous, living blamelessly among a wicked people. But there is another reading, a genetic one. Noah's lineage was uncontaminated. His bloodline had not been mixed with that of the Watchers. He represented what humanity was supposed to be, uncorrupted by unauthorized modifications. The flood would eliminate the Nephilim and the corrupted human lines. Noah and his family would survive, preserving the pure strain. After the waters receded, humanity would begin again, this time without the contamination that had caused so many problems. The flood came, the waters rose, the world as it had existed was destroyed. But not entirely. Because of Enki's warning, a remnant survived, and from that remnant, humanity began again. When the waters receded and Noah's Ark came to rest, the Anunnaki surveyed what remained. The world had been cleansed, but at tremendous cost. The infrastructure they had built over millennia was destroyed. The human population had been reduced to a handful of survivors, and there was a complication. The cleansing had not been complete. Later texts hint that the Nephilim, or something like them, appeared again after the flood. Giants are mentioned in various contexts throughout biblical history. The inhabitants of Canaan were described as including races of tremendous size. How did these giant lineages survive the flood if the flood was intended to eliminate them? One possibility is that the contamination had spread further than the Anunnaki realized. Perhaps some who entered the Ark carried dormant genetic material that would express itself in later generations. Another possibility is that not everyone on Earth experienced the same flood. Perhaps some populations survived in regions that were not fully inundated, carrying their mixed heritage through the catastrophe. Whatever the reason, the reset was incomplete. And incomplete resets have consequences that compound over subsequent cycles. After the flood, something changed in the relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity. The gods became more distant, less directly involved in human affairs. Where they had once walked among humans and ruled over cities personally, they now communicated through intermediaries, through priests and kings. But they did not abandon the project entirely. Before the main body of the Anunnaki departed on the next orbital cycle, they gave gifts to the survivors. They established the institutions of civilization, the frameworks of knowledge, the templates for organized society. This explains why civilization appeared so suddenly in the historical record. The earliest cities were not random experiments. They were sophisticated, with infrastructure and organization that suggests planning and prior knowledge. The earliest writing systems were complex, able to record detailed information almost from the moment they appeared. Somebody knew how to build cities before the first cities were built. Somebody knew how to write before writing was invented. The Anunnaki provided the blueprints, but they did not provide everything. Knowledge was shared selectively, with certain information deliberately withheld. A species that understood too much might refuse to serve. A species that possessed advanced technology without the wisdom to use it might destroy itself and the resources the Anunnaki valued. Better to provide just enough knowledge for functionality and keep the rest hidden. This policy created a pattern that would repeat throughout human history. Certain knowledge was preserved in secret, passed down through initiatic traditions that guarded it carefully. This knowledge was not religious in the sense we typically understand. It was technical, practical, useful. It included understanding of natural cycles, of astronomical events, of the 3,600-year rhythm that governed the returns. The keepers of this knowledge were not priests in the devotional sense. They were custodians of information too dangerous for general distribution, but too important to lose entirely. They formed networks, schools, traditions that have gone by many names across the centuries. Mystery schools, secret societies, hidden brotherhoods. Their purpose was preservation, keeping the count, maintaining awareness of the cycle so that when the next return came, some humans would understand what was happening. Now that we understand the framework, we can examine the evidence for the cycle in the historical and geological record. If Nibiru's orbit is real, if something genuinely returns to the inner solar system every 3,600 years, then the evidence should be visible, not as mythology, not as belief, but as measurable events, as moments when something changed dramatically, and the world that existed before could not continue unchanged. Remember what we established earlier. The effects of the cycle do not occur only at the exact moment of crossing. They begin centuries before, as gravitational forces disturb the delicate balance of the solar system. They continue centuries after, as those disturbances play out. What we are looking for is not a single date, but a pattern of periods, windows of instability, separated by approximately 3,600 years. Let us count backward through time and see what we find. One of the most mysterious events in ancient history is known today as the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades, the entire eastern Mediterranean world fell apart. This was not a gradual decline or a single conquest. It was a systemic failure that affected virtually every major civilization in the region simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, who who had built powerful kingdoms and would later be remembered in the epics of Homer, collapsed entirely. Their palace complexes were burned and abandoned. Their writing system was lost, not to be deciphered until the 20th century. Greece entered a dark age that would last for centuries. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled over much of Anatolia and challenged Egypt for control of the Levant, disintegrated. Their capital city was destroyed and never reoccupied. Their empire fractured into small successor states that retained only fragments of their former power. Egypt survived, but barely. The new kingdom, which had produced some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs, entered a long period of decline. Cities across the Levant were destroyed, often showing signs of violent burning. Ugarit, a wealthy trading city that has provided modern archaeologists with invaluable texts, was razed and never rebuilt. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries collapsed entirely. What caused this collapse? Historians have proposed many theories: earthquakes, droughts, invasions by mysterious groups called the Sea Peoples, internal rebellions, disease. The truth is that no single explanation has proven sufficient. The collapse was too widespread, too simultaneous, too complete to be explained by any one factor. Now let us add 3,600 years to that date and count backward. We arrive at approximately 4800 BCE. This period corresponds to a significant transition in human prehistory, the boundary between what archaeologists call the Ubaid period and the subsequent Uruk period in Mesopotamia. The Ubaid culture, which had spread across much of the Near East with its distinctive pottery and agricultural practices, gave way to something new. Settlement patterns changed. Social organizations shifted. The foundations for what would become Sumerian civilization were laid. Something ended, and something else began. Let us add another 3,600 years. We arrive at approximately 8400 BCE. This places us near a significant climate event known to geologists as the 8.2 kiloyear event. Around 8,200 years ago, global temperatures dropped suddenly and significantly. The climate shift lasted for several centuries and affected human populations across multiple continents. Agricultural practices were disrupted. Settlement patterns changed. Populations that had been expanding were forced to adapt or relocate. The timing is notable. It falls within the margin of error for a point on the cycle. Let us add another 3,600 years. We arrive at approximately 12,000 BCE, which places us at the boundary of one of the most dramatic climate events in recent geological history, the end of the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas was a period of sudden, severe cooling that interrupted the general warming trend as Earth emerged from the last ice age. Around 12,900 years ago, temperatures in the northern hemisphere plummeted. Conditions that had been improving for thousands of years reversed almost overnight. The cold lasted for more than 1,000 years before ending just as abruptly as it had begun, around 11,700 years ago. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains debated. Some scientists attribute it to changes in ocean circulation. Others have proposed that an impact event, a comet or asteroid striking the Earth or exploding in the atmosphere, triggered the sudden cooling. What is not debated is the severity of the event. The Younger Dryas coincided with the extinction of numerous megafauna species across North America and other continents. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large animals that had survived multiple previous ice ages, vanished during this period. The Clovis culture, one of the earliest well-documented human populations in North America, disappeared from the archaeological record. Something catastrophic happened around 12,000 years ago, something that reset the trajectory of life on Earth. And when we place this event on the 3,600-year cycle, it aligns. Let us examine this period more closely, because the evidence here is particularly compelling. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that approximately 12,900 years ago, the Earth was struck by fragments of a disintegrating comet. The impact would have caused immediate devastation in the areas affected, followed by longer-term climate effects as dust and debris blocked sunlight. The evidence for this hypothesis has been accumulating over the past 2 decades. Researchers have identified a layer of unusual materials at sites across multiple continents, all dating to approximately the same period. This layer contains nanodiamonds, microscopic particles that form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. It contains spherules of melted rock and metal. It contains elevated levels of iridium and platinum, elements that are rare on Earth's surface, but common in extraterrestrial objects. The geographic distribution of these materials is significant. They appear across North America, Europe, and parts of the Middle East, suggesting that whatever happened affected a large portion of the Northern Hemisphere simultaneously. This is consistent with the breakup of a comet, which would have scattered fragments across a wide area. Now consider what could cause comet fragments to strike Earth at a particular time rather than randomly. In normal circumstances, comets orbit the Sun on highly elliptical paths, spending most of their time in the outer solar system. The chances of Earth being struck during any particular passage are relatively small. But if something disturbed the outer solar system, if gravitational forces destabilized the orbits of objects that had been stable for millions of years, the probability of impacts would increase dramatically. Objects that had never posed a threat could be deflected into new trajectories. This is exactly what you would expect if a massive body passed through the solar system on a long elliptical orbit. The gravitational effects would begin long before the body itself became visible, disturbing the Oort cloud and the Kuiper belt, sending debris inward like waves spreading from a stone dropped in still water. The Younger Dryas impact, if it occurred, may not have been random chance. It may have been a consequence of the cycle, a predictable result of disturbances in the outer solar system that occur whenever Nibiru's orbit brings it close enough to affect the gravitational balance. This interpretation connects several pieces of evidence that are usually considered separately. The cycle explains the timing of the event. The gravitational disturbance explains the mechanism. The impact explains the sudden onset and severity of the climate change. And the climate change explains the megafauna extinctions. Each piece of evidence, considered alone, has alternative explanations, but together they form a pattern that is difficult to explain through coincidence alone. The pattern continues the further back we look. At approximately 15,600 BCE, we find evidence of significant changes in human settlement patterns. At approximately 19,200 BCE, we are deep in the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the most recent ice age. At approximately 22,800 BCE, another climate fluctuation appears in ice core records. The further back we go, the harder it becomes to identify specific events with precision. But the pattern suggests that something has been happening at regular intervals for tens of thousands of years, perhaps longer. If the cycle is real, it did not begin with humanity. It preceded us. The evidence for the cycle is not confined to Mesopotamia. It appears in various forms across virtually every ancient culture that left records. The names change, the specific details differ, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. Consider the ancient Greeks. They spoke of multiple ages of humanity, each ending in catastrophe. The Golden Age gave way to the Silver Age, which gave way to the Bronze Age, which gave way to the Age of Heroes, which gave way to the current Iron Age. Each transition involved destruction and decline. The Egyptian priest Manetho compiled a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BCE that listed dynasties stretching back tens of thousands of years. Like the Sumerian King List, Manetho's early dynasties include reign lengths that seem impossible by human standards. The ancient Hindu traditions provide another parallel. The Vedic texts describe cycles of cosmic time called yugas, 4 ages that repeat in sequence across vast spans of time. The complete cycle of 4 yugas is called a Mahayuga, which lasts 4,320,000 years. This number is mathematically significant because it is divisible by 3,600. In fact, 4,320,000 divided by 3,600 equals exactly 1,200. This mathematical relationship could be coincidence, or it could indicate that the Hindu sages were working with the same underlying system. The current age, according to Hindu tradition, is the Kali Yuga, the darkest and most degenerate of the 4 ages. It began, according to traditional calculations, around 3100 BCE. This date falls close to the period when Sumerian civilization was emerging, when writing was being developed. The Maya of Central America developed one of the most sophisticated calendrical systems in human history. Their long count calendar measured time from a starting point that corresponds to August 11th, 3114 BCE. This date is remarkably close to the beginning of the Hindu Kali Yuga. Multiple ancient cultures on different continents, with no apparent means of communication, seem to have identified the same general period as a beginning point, a reset, a moment when the count started fresh. The alignment of ancient structures to astronomical events is another line of evidence. Sites like Stonehenge in England, the pyramids of Giza in Egypt, Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and the temples of Teotihuacan in Mexico all demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. Consider the Great Pyramid of Giza. Its base is level to within just over 2 centimeters across more than 230 meters. Its sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of less than 1/12 of a degree. The ratio of its perimeter to its height approximates pi with remarkable precision. How did they achieve this? The standard answer is careful observation over long periods. But there is another possibility. Perhaps the knowledge was not developed, but inherited, passed down from a time when such understanding was more widespread, preserved through catastrophes that destroyed the civilizations that created it. The temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia provide another example. The entire complex is aligned to mark the spring equinox with precision. But more than that, Researchers have noticed that the positions of the main temples mirror the constellation Draco as it appeared around 10,500 BCE. This is not the period when the temples were built. It is a date encoded into their layout, a message pointing backward in time to a moment that the builders considered significant. Why would 12th century Cambodian architects encode the position of stars from 12,000 years earlier? Unless they possessed knowledge of that earlier period, knowledge that told them something important had happened then, something worth commemorating in stone for future generations to discover. The flood stories that appear in cultures worldwide provide perhaps the most compelling evidence for shared memory of catastrophic events. More than 500 distinct flood narratives have been identified across human cultures. They appear on every inhabited continent. A man is warned of coming destruction. He builds a vessel. He preserves his family and representatives of animal life. The world is flooded. The waters eventually recede. Humanity begins again. The names differ, the details vary, but the core narrative remains remarkably consistent. This is exactly what you would expect if a real event had occurred, an event severe enough to burn itself into the collective memory of all human cultures, preserved through thousands of years of retelling, despite the distortions that inevitably accumulate over such spans. The Aboriginal Australians preserve memories of rising sea levels that match the geological record of coastal flooding at the end of the last ice age. Their oral traditions describe specific landmarks that were inundated, landmarks that underwater archaeology has since confirmed existed. These memories have been preserved for more than 10,000 years. This capacity for accurate transmission suggests that other ancient memories might be equally reliable. If Aboriginal traditions accurately preserved the flooding of specific coastlines for 10,000 years, why should we assume that Sumerian traditions about the Anunnaki are mere fantasy? The mystery traditions of the ancient world all claimed to possess secrets from before the deluge. Egypt, Babylon, Greece, India. Each culture spoke of wisdom inherited from an earlier age, knowledge too dangerous for common people, too important to be lost entirely. In Egypt, the priests of Heliopolis claimed to possess records stretching back tens of thousands of years. They spoke of a time before the pharaohs, when gods walked the earth and ruled directly over humanity. They guarded their knowledge carefully, sharing it only with initiates. The Greek philosophers who traveled to Egypt reported being told of ancient catastrophes and lost civilizations. Plato's account of Atlantis claims to derive from Egyptian priests who possessed records of events unknown to the Greeks. In India, the tradition of the Guru-Shishya lineage was designed specifically to preserve knowledge across generations without loss or distortion. Sacred texts were memorized in their entirety, passed down through recitation, maintained with precision across centuries. These traditions did not disappear with the ancient world. They transformed, adapted, went deeper underground as Christianity and later Islam spread. The Gnostic movements, the Hermetic traditions, the alchemists, all claimed connection to ancient wisdom, secrets preserved from the time of the Egyptian priests, or even earlier. The keepers of the count would be the most important of these traditions, not those who preserved spiritual teachings, but those who preserved practical, technical knowledge. The astronomical calculations, the understanding of cycles, the awareness of what returns and when. If such keepers exist today, they would operate through the institutions that wield power in the modern world. They would not wear robes or meet in candlelit temples. They would wear suits and meet in boardrooms. But their function would be the same: preserving the count, preparing for the return. Now let us turn to the question that matters most for those of us alive today. Where are we in the cycle? This is where we must think carefully about what the evidence actually tells us. The Bronze Age collapse occurred around 1200 BCE. If we simply add 3,600 years to that date, we arrive at approximately 2400 CE. Seemingly placing the next crossing far in the future. But remember what we established at the beginning. The catastrophes do not occur only at the moment of crossing. They occur throughout the approach phase and the recession phase. The window of instability can span centuries. And there is another consideration. We do not know with certainty that the Bronze Age collapse marked the exact midpoint of a crossing. It may have occurred during the approach phase or during the recession. The event we can identify may be offset from the true orbital position. The honest answer is that we cannot pinpoint our position with certainty. The ancient records are incomplete. The dates we use are approximations. The cycle itself may vary slightly from the precise 3,600-year figure. What we can say is this: if the cycle is real, and if the approach phase generates effects centuries before the crossing itself, then we cannot rule out the possibility that we are already within that window of instability. Look at what has been happening in recent decades. Climate patterns have destabilized in ways that models struggle to fully explain. The magnetic poles are shifting faster than at any recorded period in history. Solar activity has become increasingly erratic. Earthquake activity shows concerning patterns in certain regions. These phenomena could have mundane explanations: climate change from human activity, natural variations in solar output, random clustering of geological events. Each individual observation can be explained without reference to any cycle. But taken together, they are consistent with what you would expect if the approach phase of a cosmic cycle had begun. Gravitational disturbances affecting the sun's output, perturbations in Earth's magnetic field, increased activity from objects deflected from stable orbits in the outer solar system. Let us examine each of these phenomena more carefully. The acceleration of magnetic pole movement is particularly noteworthy. The magnetic North Pole has been tracked by scientists since the early 19th century, when it was located in the Canadian Arctic. For most of the period since then, it moves slowly, covering perhaps a few kilometers per year. But beginning in the 1990s, the rate of movement increased dramatically. The pole is now racing across the Arctic toward Siberia at speeds exceeding 50 kilometers per year. Magnetic pole movement is caused by changes in the convection patterns of Earth's liquid outer core. If a massive body were approaching from the outer solar system, its gravitational influence would begin affecting Earth long before it became visible. Changes in the core's convection patterns would be one expected result. Some researchers have noted that Earth's magnetic field has weakened by approximately 15% over the past 2 centuries. This weakening is not uniform. Certain regions, particularly an area over the South Atlantic, have experienced much more dramatic reductions. Solar activity provides another line of evidence. The Sun operates on an approximately 11-year cycle of activity. But recent solar cycles have not behaved as expected. Solar cycle 24 which peaked around 2014, was one of the weakest in over a century. What could cause the Sun to behave unexpectedly? If a very massive body were approaching from the outer solar system, its gravitational influence could subtly affect the Sun's internal processes. The effects might manifest as anomalies in the solar cycle. I want to be clear. I am not claiming that these phenomena prove the approach of Nibiru. Each can be explained through conventional science. Random variation accounts for much of what we observe. But they are consistent with what the ancient texts predict. And there are other signs that suggest some who possess power and resources may be preparing for something significant. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, carved into a mountain on a remote Norwegian island, stores samples of seeds from food crops around the world. Its purpose, officially, is to preserve agricultural biodiversity against regional disasters. But the scale and location suggest preparation for something more. The vault is designed to survive global catastrophes. It is located at 78 degrees north latitude, carved into a mountain, protected by hundreds of meters of rock. Why these specifications? Regional disasters would not require such elaborate measures. The facility is designed for something else entirely. Similar patterns appear in other infrastructure projects. Underground facilities have been expanded around the world. There has been substantial investment in the ability to detect and track objects approaching from deep space. Planetary defense has become a formal area of study. The capability to deflect or destroy incoming objects has been tested and refined. There has been particular focus on the ability to detect objects approaching from directions that are difficult to observe, coming from the outer solar system on trajectories that would not be visible until relatively late. This is exactly the trajectory that Nibiru would follow, if it exists. The scientific community has noted anomalies in the outer solar system that remain unexplained. The orbits of certain distant objects show clustering patterns that suggest gravitational influence from something unseen. Some astronomers have proposed the existence of a large planet far beyond Neptune, a world they call Planet 9. The evidence for Planet 9 comes from several independent lines of observation. The orbits of trans-Neptunian objects show alignments that are difficult to explain through random chance. Something appears to be shepherding these objects, organizing their orbits through gravitational influence. The proposed orbit for Planet 9 is highly elliptical. Its orbital period is estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 years. This is not proof of Nibiru, but it demonstrates that our understanding of the outer solar system is incomplete. In recent years, there has also been a remarkable shift in how governments discuss unidentified aerial phenomena. Agencies that previously denied any interest in the subject have released information, acknowledged investigations, and admitted that they cannot explain certain observations. If those in positions of authority believe that contact with non-human intelligence is approaching, or that significant cosmic events are imminent, gradual disclosure might be a strategy for preparing the public. This interpretation is speculative, but it is consistent with the pattern we have been tracing. Whether we are in the approach window now, or whether the crossing remains centuries distant, the implications are the same. The cycle will continue. Another return will eventually occur. And what humanity becomes between now and then will determine how we experience what comes. The keepers of the count have always understood this. They preserved knowledge not to prevent the cycle, but to ensure that humanity would face it with understanding rather than confusion. They knew that awareness, even without the power to prevent, transforms the experience. If you have followed this voice to this point, you have received what they have always offered. Not certainty, not dates, not guarantees, just the pattern, just the framework, just the awareness that history operates on scales larger than any individual life. The Anunnaki calendar counts, whether we acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether the cycle will complete. The question is what humanity will be when it does. Perhaps we will be found wanting, as we have been found in previous cycles. Perhaps the reset will come again, sweeping away what we have built, forcing another beginning from near zero. Or perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps enough of us will understand. Perhaps enough of us will prepare, not bunkers and seed vaults, but awareness and knowledge, and the determination to carry understanding through whatever comes. The cycle does not care about our hopes. It continues regardless. But what we become within it, what we carry, what we preserve, what we pass on, that is up to us. The night is deep now, wherever you are. The stars turn overhead, following patterns set in motion billions of years ago. Somewhere, far beyond the light of our sun, something is moving through the darkness, completing an orbit that began when humanity was young. The count continues, the calendar turns, and you, listening now, are part of what happens next. Sleep well, and remember, you are not alone in the dark. You never were.